This video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Check out Squarespace through the link in the description below. More on them in a bit. Roughly every 100,000 years, our planet undergoes one of the most violent catastrophes imaginable. Supervolcanoes are to regular volcanoes what supermassive black holes are to regular black holes, or the Incredible Hulk is to Hulk Hogan. Bigger, badder, and infinitely more terrifying. Capable of ejecting 1,000 cubic kilotons of material, even the smallest supervolcano dwarfs any eruption in human history. Mount St. Helens, Krakatoa, Vesuvius, all are mere sparks against such infernos. But while no supervolcano has erupted since the dawn of civilization, that doesn't mean they're gone. If you live in America, you may have even visited one. Yellowstone National Park is famous for its beauty, but just under the surface lies something far uglier, a plume of molten rock that, were it to cause an eruption, could potentially kill millions. So where did this supervolcano come from? How likely is it to explode? And what would happen to the world if it did? Today, Geographics is uncovering Yellowstone's explosive past and taking a glimpse into its apocalyptic future. On April 10, 1815, Tambora volcano in Indonesia exploded with a force unprecedented in recorded history. Over 3 days, 175 cubic kilometers of debris were ejected into the atmosphere atop a plume of ash 45 kilometers high. So much material was hurled into the sky that it darkened the sun. The following year, 1816, would become known as the year without summer, a year in which ice froze rivers in August, flooding destroyed crops, and famine and disease ran riot. Thanks to these climactic effects, it's thought that as many as 82,000 people died all across the globe. It was by far the biggest eruption since the dawn of human civilization, dwarfing even the Hekla III eruption that may have triggered the Bronze Age collapse. But here comes the kicker. This apocalyptic volcano that affected the entire planet, that was just a regular volcano. By contrast, were a supervolcano to explode today, it would make Tambora look like a Girl Scout bake sale. In the history of the Earth, there have been around 50 known super eruptions. The most recent occurred at New Zealand's Lake Taupo about 26,000 years ago. But while a video about Taupo's explosive past would be great, that's not what we're here to discuss today. No, we're here to talk about the most famous supervolcano of them all, Yellowstone. To give you an idea of how the Yellowstone supervolcano formed, you have to go back in time, way, way back to prehistory. Until roughly 66 million years ago, the entire Yellowstone area was covered by an inland sea. But then the Cenozoic Era began and brought with it a burst of volcanic activity. Now, this was volcanic activity unrelated to the modern supervolcano, but it did result in the Absaroka mountain range popping into existence, giving Yellowstone its northern and eastern borders. However, it was what happened some 49 million years later that changed the park's fate. If you had been floating above the North American continent and watching the millennia pass by on fast forward, it would have looked like a whole bunch of volcanoes suddenly started springing up around the Nevada, Oregon, and Idaho border. Those volcanoes would have started marching east, popping up one by one on an 800-kilometer journey towards northwest Wyoming. But this would have just been the view from above. Underground, a very different story would be taking place. Rather than the volcanoes themselves marching northeast, the reality was that the North American plate was slowly grinding southwest over a sunken bubble of magma. Imagine a carpet being dragged across a warped old wooden floor with a bump on it. As the carpet moves, the bump would stay in the same place, making different parts of the carpet rise up at different times. In a very simple way, that was what was happening in prehistoric America over millions of years. Finally, some 2.1 million years ago, that bump found itself under a thin, threadbare piece of carpet marked Yellowstone. It's at this point that things got interesting. Not long after the magma bump found itself below Yellowstone, it gave its first super eruption. Since we don't have any records of a supervolcano blowing, we don't know what it would actually look like, but we can definitely guess. Over thousands of years, magma, water vapor, and gases would have built up inside the bump until the pressure made it start to grow. Stood on the ground, you would have seen a dome getting bigger and bigger. Finally, it would have gotten so big that the edges started to tear, providing release for the pressure below. By the time you noticed that, though, your last chance to run would have been long gone. The first Yellowstone super eruption was almost beyond comprehension. Over 6,000 times the size of Mount St. Helens, it released 2,500 cubic kilometers of debris. Over 15,000 square kilometers of North America was coated in ash. Where the magma blew, the Earth collapsed, forming a depression the size of Rhode Island. In the aftermath, the gases expelled would have dimmed the sun, plunging the entire planet into a winter that lasted for years. It was the first example of the supervolcano's raw power, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. In its 2 million years of existence, the Yellowstone supervolcano has never again erupted with the force of its first major blast. But even its two smaller super eruptions were still what we'd call pretty damn big. Take the super eruption of 640,000 BC, the third of Yellowstone's three major explosions. It went up with the force of 2,500 Mount St. Helens eruptions. That meant a plume of ash 30 kilometers high, so big that it left debris as far away as the Gulf of Mexico. It meant gigantic superheated clouds of rock and ash nearly 10,000 Celsius hot, sweeping across modern Wyoming, burying the lands beneath a layer over 100 meters deep. Anything within 1,000 kilometers of the eruption almost certainly died. In the aftermath, another gigantic caldera formed, this one capable of swallowing the whole of Samoa. Even the smallest of the three super eruptions, the one that blew in between these two monsters, would have been an awe-inspiring sight to behold. Well, at least it would have until it totally killed you. However, it would be wrong to think that the Yellowstone volcano is only capable of planet-cooling blasts. Between 640,000 and 70,000 BC, some 80 eruptions transformed the Yellowstone landscape. Although some created features that we'd still recognize today, like the Pitchstone Plateau, none of them were even close to being Tambora-sized, let alone super eruptions. And it's here that we get to one of the biggest misconceptions about supervolcanoes, and that's that because of their size, anytime they blow, it has to be a super eruption. The reality is that most supervolcanoes only rarely erupt at their full capacity. They're more likely to just sit there, bubbling away, creating groovy effects on the surface. Yellowstone's volcano is a prime example of this. All those steam vents, hot springs, and mud cauldrons that you've seen in your auntie's vacation photos, well, they're all due to that great big magma chamber that we talked about earlier. Because the ground in Yellowstone is cracked, water is constantly worming its way down to the magma, getting superheated, and shooting right back up to the surface. The 300 geysers in Yellowstone Park, over half of the total in the world, only exist because they're on the surface of a volcano so big you can't even see it. So next time you roll out there in your RV and watch Old Faithful do its thing, just remember that the supervolcano below isn't only good for inspiring, scary YouTube documentaries. In fact, without the plume of molten rock under Wyoming, a plume that stretches at least 960 kilometers down and likely as far as 3,000 kilometers, there wouldn't be a national park for you to visit at all. That's because it was these outside signs of volcanic activity that made people think the area was worth preserving in the first place. Now, just before we get into the rest of today's video, I do want to take a quick moment to thank our fantastic sponsor who makes these videos possible, and that's Squarespace. Now, a couple of things. Maybe you've got an idea for a website or a YouTube channel or a business or a podcast, something knocking around in your head, and you're like, I should probably do that. Maybe I should do that. Well, two, the only way to find out whether that is worth doing is to get it out there into the world. And I know that can be daunting because trying new things is scary, but not knowing how to set up a website to get your idea out there is not an excuse, because Squarespace makes starting a website incredibly easy. Squarespace allows you to create a powerful website for whatever you're up to. You want to sell something online? Yes, absolutely. Set up a store with Squarespace. Want to do a podcast? Sure, they support that. Now, it all starts on Squarespace with a beautiful template that you can customize to your heart's content, or start from scratch if you've got some design chops, or move over from an existing domain. And once you've gone through the super easy customization process, there are no updates, there's no patches, there's no tech BS that you have to deal with. And Squarespace also handles all of that website-y stuff. Podcasts, yes. Mailing lists, of course. Social integrations, absolutely. Like I say, Squarespace removes the excuses to your dreams. So go get started. Just do it now. And there's 24/7 customer support in case you get stuck, but you probably won't. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics, and you'll save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain, and let's get back to it. On August 29th, 1870, the gloriously bemustached Gustavus Doane scaled Mount Washburn. A Civil War veteran turned explorer, the 30-year-old Doane was in Wyoming as part of, as his name suggests, the Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition. At this point in American history, much of the interior was still a fascinating mystery. The West had been tamed, but many of those places lying between the coasts were still the 19th century equivalent of an old-timey map marked "Here be monsters." It was a mere 43 years earlier that the first description of Yellowstone had appeared in a newspaper, only 34 years earlier that the first rough map had been made. In the decades since, trappers, explorers, and one priest had visited the area, but the stories they brought back of the landscape were too fantastical to be believed. At the moment Gustavus Doane started scrambling up the side of his mountain, the average American's opinion of Yellowstone was basically, what's Yellowstone? It was the Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition's task to make sure that changed. At long last, Doane reached the top of Mount Washburn. All around him stretched the wilds of Wyoming, the great, rugged view that would soon become known as the Yellowstone National Park. To the south, the Rocky Mountains rose and fell, adding texture to the view. But there was an anomaly. As Doane squinted, he noticed there was a break in the mountain range, a place where a flat circle of forest seemed to have been crudely carved out of the landscape. Not long after, the explorer recorded his theory on it. The Great Basin, he wrote, has been formerly one vast crater of a now extinct volcano. It was the first time in history anyone had realized the explosive secret Yellowstone was hiding. Prior to Doane's expedition, humans had been coming to the Yellowstone region for thousands of years. We know this because tools dating back to 9000 BC have been unearthed at sites across the park. Since they're from so far back, though, we have no idea who they belonged to. The name of the people who produced these tools has been lost to time as effectively as if it had been written on paper and then dropped into a raging river. It wasn't until the 15th century that we got a Yellowstone-based culture that still survives. Known as the Shoshone, or sometimes sheep-eaters, the tribe settled the park around 1400 AD. Quite what they made of the strange lakes, geysers, and hot rivers wasn't recorded, but we can assume it probably blew their minds. That's because minds being blown is a pretty consistent feature of Yellowstone's past. When the first white people arrived in Yellowstone 400 years after the Shoshone, their accounts were often laughed off by those living on America's coasts as the wild ravings of deluded woodsmen. The idea of hot rivers and jets of boiling water was simply too far-fetched, like if someone told you today about a secret place in Idaho with candy floss trees. It didn't help that the government's official expedition to the area failed to reach it, leaving most people in the dark about the awe-inspiring landscape. But as the 19th century rolled on, more explorers and trappers started coming back from Yellowstone with similar tales, and it was decided this mythic place needed to be surveyed properly. And so it was, in 1870, both Doane's three-name expedition and the near-simultaneous Hayden expedition set off to uncover Yellowstone's secrets. In their own ways, both would transform how humankind saw this remote corner of Wyoming. As Doane clambered back down Washburn Mountain on that hot day in 1870, he was heading back to a very different world. When the Hayden expedition returned, it would be with photographs and paintings of Yellowstone that would capture the public's attention. It would be off the back of these images that Congress acted, passing a bill signed into law on March 1, 1872, that made Yellowstone one of the first national parks in the world, possibly the very first. There's a contender in Mongolia that might have pipped it to the post, but it would be Doane who would eventually make the most intriguing contribution. The idea of a vast dead volcano underneath Yellowstone lingered in the imagination. For a long time, almost 8 decades in fact, it was part of the lore of the park. But then, at some point in the mid-20th century, people decided to check to see if the volcano was really as dead as Doane had claimed. What they eventually found would explode everything America thought it knew about its favorite park. The fact that we ever discovered the truth about Yellowstone is down almost entirely to two things: a lump of rock and a disappointing boat trip. Let's start with the rock first. In the late 1950s, a Harvard grad student named Francis Joe Boyd was poking around the park when he stumbled across something called a welded tuff. Now, to you or me, a welded tuff would look like nothing more than just a normal lump of rock. But Boyd was a geologist, and to him, a welded tuff didn't look like a random rock. It looked like what it was: ash which had once been burning hot before becoming compressed and solidifying. It also looked like something that had come from a geologically recent eruption. But one rock, no matter how weird, does not a theory prove. Even as two more welded tuffs were discovered in Yellowstone Park, the jury still remained out. It would take a weird boat trip to change all of that. Let's jump cut ahead to 1973, where Bob Smith, another geologist, was boating across Yellowstone Lake for some work when he came to an old dock. A couple of decades before, Smith had moored his boat at this same dock, but now it was underwater and useless. What's more, the tree line was flooded out too. Being far brainier than us, Smith didn't just shrug this off as a weird thing and carry on with his life. Instead, he took a survey of the entire Hayden Valley area, then compared it to data from 1923. What he found was jaw-dropping. The north end of Yellowstone Lake had risen nearly 75 centimeters, sending extra water flooding down the southern end and submerging the old dock. There was only one reason the ground might swell upwards like this: the volcano beneath Yellowstone must still be alive. Smith's findings caused a minor sensation. It helped that Smith was good at turning a phrase, such as when he described Yellowstone as a living, breathing caldera, but it also helped that the park kept on doing weird things. In the mid-1980s, there was a cluster of earthquakes, after which the ground settled back down again to the height it had been in 1923. Over the next couple of decades, geologists, volcanologists, and lots of other people with jobs ending in ologist studied the heck out of Yellowstone. It was during this time that the giant magma plume was discovered, that the volcanic timeline from this video's first section was pieced together. Slowly, as the sheer size and power of the Yellowstone volcano dawned, a term rose to describe it. A term that started as strictly unscientific but soon became so widely used that science co-opted it. That term was a supervolcano. Barely had the apocalyptic connotations of that term become clear than in the mid-2000s the ground started rising beneath Yellowstone Lake again. But if you were expecting to hear that we're now in the run-up to an eruption, well, you're about to be a bit disappointed. It's been estimated that the odds of Yellowstone erupting in any year are about 0.00014%. By way of comparison, it's actually more likely that another Chicxulub-sized asteroid will come slamming into Earth than it is that Yellowstone will blow its top in our lifetimes. Even when it does finally blow again, the odds are even slimmer that it'll be a super eruption. You may have seen claims that Yellowstone erupts on a schedule and that we're overdue for another catastrophic eruption, but volcanoes, with rare exceptions, simply don't work like that. The boring truth is that Yellowstone probably won't go off for thousands more years, and when it does, it'll likely be a lava flow that's destructive within the park itself, but barely noticeable for the world at large. That being said, though, there is still the tiniest chance that the big one could really happen soon. Yes, it is time for us to witness America's Armageddon. Because no supervolcano has erupted in recorded history, we don't really know what it's going to be like if Yellowstone suddenly went all Old Testament on America's ass. But we can make some educated guesses. For instance, it seems reasonable to assume that the ground around Yellowstone Lake would start swelling again, doming upwards as magma rose into the chamber. Quite possibly, this dome would rise on a scale that we've never witnessed before. With the ground heaving upwards, we'd start to get earthquakes as the magma pushed solid rock out of its way to get to the surface. The closer we got to liftoff, the shallower these earthquakes would get. Pretty soon, they'd likely be detected across the entire park, along with a sharp and sudden increase in CO2. In other words, we'd probably have some pretty distinct warning signs. But that almost wouldn't matter, because when the magma finally reached the surface, we'd hit midnight on the doomsday clock. Assuming an eruption as big as Yellowstone's last super eruption, the effects would be devastating beyond belief. Lava would inundate the park within a radius of roughly 65 kilometers. This would suck for campers, but the real problem wouldn't be on the ground, it'd be in the air. Thousands of cubic kilometers of volcanic ash would be blasted high over Wyoming. What happens next would depend a lot on the winds, but one likely outcome would be a layer almost a meter thick settling over most of Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, Idaho, and Utah. This wouldn't be like a layer of snow. Just 30 centimeters of ash can collapse a roof. Every water supply it touched would be poisoned. But it's not like anyone would be around to worry about it, apart from the few unfortunate survivors. Within 1,000 kilometers of the blast, it's estimated that 90% of people would be killed. A quick back-of-the-envelope calculation puts that north of 10 million people. And Yellowstone would just be getting started. As the ash traveled, it would blanket the Midwest. Not deep enough to crush buildings, but deep enough to cause large-scale crop failures and to make travel, and thus escape, an impossibility. It would also be thick enough to cause major respiratory problems in anyone caught outside. As the BBC once memorably put it, inhaled ash forms a cement-like mixture in human lungs. By the time you reached the east coast, the ash layer would be a single centimeter thick. Even at this thinness, though, it would badly disrupt travel, which would in turn mess up supply chains. Overall, it's estimated that 3/4 of the USA would be plunged into a deranged post-apocalyptic fantasy, and that would just be for starters. Over the coming days, the ash from Yellowstone would drift across the Atlantic until it also coated Europe. Remember the Icelandic eruption in April of 2010 that grounded every single plane on the continent? Well, that would happen all over again. While actual damage in Europe would be minimal, the economic cost would be enormous. Finally, once 3 weeks had passed, the gases unleashed into the atmosphere by Yellowstone would have completely shrouded the planet. When Tambora erupted in 1815, causing the year without a summer, it cooled the planet by something like 1.7 degrees Celsius. A Yellowstone eruption, on the other hand, would cool the planet by up to 12 degrees Celsius. Nor would the effects only last a year. Were Yellowstone to blow today, the 2020s would become known as the decade without a summer. 10 whole years in which every day was like a wet November in northern England. Crops would fail, the monsoon would be disrupted, causing mass starvation in Asia. When the after effects finally faded, the sun would shine back down on a planet, on a human civilization that would have been irrevocably changed. But it would also shine down on a human race that was still alive. Yes, it would be a decade of catastrophe, misery, and really awful experiences, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. It's not even a sure bet that it would be the end of the USA. Back in the Cold War, government scientists estimated that losing 1/4 of America's population in a nuclear exchange still wouldn't be enough to destroy the United States as a political entity. In the aftermath of a Yellowstone eruption, the US would slowly, surely rebuild from its Armageddon. It might take decades, it might even take centuries, but in the end, the most devastating eruption in human history would fade into memory just as surely as the Black Death or the Napoleonic Wars. But this most probably won't happen. As the American continent continues to move southwest, the magma chamber has found itself no longer under Yellowstone's thin basin crust, but under the thicker crust of the Rockies. This could be enough to keep the supervolcano bottled up now forever. So that's it then. The history of both Yellowstone Park and the volcano sleeping beneath it. The volcano that will almost certainly never blow. But if you do one day find yourself in northwestern Wyoming and hear the reports about the ground rising up wildly and earthquakes getting shallower and shallower and CO2 escaping across the park, then don't run. Just close your eyes, cross your fingers, and pray. Because if the big one is coming, and that's still a pretty big if, there'll be nothing else that you can possibly do. So I really hope you found that video interesting, slightly terrifying. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Also, please do check out our fantastic sponsor, Squarespace. They're linked to below. And thank you for watching.